Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The problem of universals. Why redness exists everywhere and nowhere. A philosopher observes that multiple objects share properties. Multiple things are red, multiple objects are round, multiple animals are cats. And this sharing, this commonality, requires explanation, requires understanding what it is for different things to have the same property. And this is the problem of universals, one of the oldest and most fundamental problems in metaphysics. The question of whether properties like redness or roundness or cathood are real entities that exist independently of particular objects, are universals that multiple particulars instantiate, or whether properties are merely names, merely words we use to group similar objects without corresponding to any real shared entity. And the problem divides philosophers into realists who accept that universals exist and nominalists who deny them, and both positions face difficulties. Both must explain how we think and talk about properties, how science discovers laws about kinds, how resemblance works, and neither position has one consensus. And the problem of universals remains one of the deepest questions in ontology, a question about the fundamental furniture of reality, about what kinds of things exist. Imagine two red objects, a red ball and a red shirt, and they share something, they are both red, and the question is what this sharing amounts to, what grounds the similarity. And the realist says both objects instantiate the same universal, the property redness, which exists as a separate entity, an abstract object that is somehow present in both particulars. And the universal redness is one thing that exists in multiple places, is wholly present in each red object. And this explains similarity, explains how multiple things can be red. They all instantiate the same universal. And the nominalist says there is no universal. There are only the particular red objects, and the similarity is primitive, is a brute fact, or is explained by resemblance. The objects resemble each other, or is explained by linguistic convention. We call both red using the same word, and redness is not a real entity, but is a feature of our language or conceptual scheme. The problem can be stated as a dilemma. Either properties are universals, abstract entities that exist independently of particulars, or properties are just features of particulars. And if properties are universals, then we face the problem of how abstract entities relate to concrete particulars, how universals are present in objects, whether they exist in Plato's realm of forms separate from physical reality or exist in objects themselves, as Aristotle thought. And if properties are just features of particulars, then we face the problem of explaining resemblance, explaining what makes multiple objects similar, what grounds classification into kinds, and neither horn is comfortable, neither provides an obvious easy answer. And the problem of universals forces us to choose between problematic metaphysics or problematic nominalism. Visualize the realist picture, a realm of abstract universals, redness, roundness, cathood, existing eternally and independently, and particular objects participating in these universals, instantiating them, exemplifying them, and an object is red by standing in an instantiation relation to the universal redness. And this relation is mysterious, is not itself explained. How do abstract universals connect to concrete particulars? How does the abstract realm interact with the physical realm? And the realist must either accept this as primitive, as an unexplained connection, or provide a theory of instantiation. And various theories have been proposed, but all face difficulties, all struggle to explain how universals and particulars relate. One version of realism, Platonic realism, says universals exist in a separate realm, a realm of forms, and particulars participate in forms. And the perfect circle exists in the realm of forms, and physical circles approximate it, participate in it imperfectly. And this explains how we can think about perfect circles, even though no physical object is perfectly circular. We grasp the form directly through reason, but the theory faces the problem of how we access the realm of forms, how our minds, which are physical, can connect to abstract entities, and the theory faces the problem of how participation works, how forms relate to particulars. And Aristotle rejected Platonic realism, argued that forms exist in particulars, are immanent in objects, not transcendent, and redness exists in red objects, is a component of them, and this avoids the separate realm, but creates other problems. How can one form be in many places? How can universals be divided among particulars? Nominalism rejects universals entirely, accepts only particulars, and explains similarity without appealing to shared properties. And various nominalist strategies exist. Resemblance nominalism says objects are similar because they resemble each other, and resemblance is primitive, not explained by shared properties. And redness is just the class of objects that resemble paradigm red objects. And this avoids commitment to universals but faces the problem that resemblance seems to presuppose properties, seems to require that objects share something. And if resemblance is primitive, then we have not really eliminated properties but renamed them. And resemblance nominalism faces technical difficulties with explaining degrees of resemblance, with avoiding circularity. Another nominalist approach, predicate nominalism, says properties are just predicates, just words, and redness is the predicate red, and objects are red by satisfying the predicate. And this linguistic nominalism faces the problem of explaining why predicates apply. What makes it true that an object satisfies red? And the answer seems to require properties after all, seems to presuppose that objects have features that make predicates apply. And so predicate nominalism seems to presuppose what it denies, seems to need properties to explain predication. A third nominalist approach, trope theory, accepts that properties exist but denies that they are universals, argues that properties are particulars, are individual instances, and each red object has its own individual redness, its own red trope, and tropes resemble each other. Explains similarity, and universals are eliminated, replaced by classes of resembling tropes, and this approach preserves some realist insights, accepts that properties are real, while avoiding commitment to abstract universals, and trope theory has been developed extensively, has become a major alternative to both traditional realism and nominalism, and provides a middle ground that many find attractive. The problem of universals also affects science, affects understanding what scientific laws are, because laws concern kinds, concern all electrons or all mammals, and laws seem to involve universals, seem to say that all objects instantiating a certain universal behave in certain ways, and if universals do not exist, then what are laws about? Are they merely regularities in particular objects? Are they conventions of our theorizing? And nominalists must explain how science discovers objective laws if kinds are not real, if universals do not exist. And this challenge drives some philosophers toward realism, toward accepting that kinds are real, that universals exist because science seems to require them. The red ball and red shirt share something or do not share anything, are similar by instantiating a universal or by resembling each other. And the problem of universals asks which, asks what properties are, whether they are real entities or linguistic conveniences, whether redness exists in Plato's heaven or in particular red things or only in our conceptual scheme. And the answers divide philosophers, have divided them for millennia. And the problem remains unsolved, remains central to metaphysics, and redness exists everywhere in all red things. If realism is true, and nowhere if nominalism is true, and the problem persists, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology, a question about whether reality contains abstract repeatable entities, or only concrete, unrepeatable particulars, and the universal's weight, existing or not existing, and the problem endures. The rubber hand illusion, when a fake hand becomes yours. A person sits at a table, their real hand hidden from view behind a screen, and a rubber hand, a realistic prosthetic, is placed in front of them where they can see it, and the experimenter uses two paintbrushes, simultaneously stroking the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand in synchrony. The same strokes at the same times on corresponding locations, and after several minutes, something strange happens. The person begins to feel as though the rubber hand is their hand, feels the touch sensations as coming from the rubber hand rather than from the hidden real hand, and when the experimenter threatens the rubber hand, moves a hammer toward it, as if to strike, the person flinches, shows a physiological stress response, reacts as though the rubber hand is in danger. And this is the rubber hand illusion, discovered by Botvinnik and Cohen in 1998. A phenomenon demonstrating that body ownership, the sense that a body part is yours, is not fixed but is flexible, can be manipulated, can be extended to objects that are not part of your body, and the illusion reveals that the sense of body ownership is constructed by the brain through integration of visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. And when these signals are consistent, when vision shows a hand being touched in the same way, and at the same time as tactile signals indicate your hand is being touched, the brain infers that the seen hand is your hand, updates the body representation, and the rubber hand is incorporated into the body schema. And the rubber hand illusion has profound implications for understanding embodiment, for understanding the sense of self, for prosthetic design, and for recognizing that the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are dynamic and constructed. Imagine the subjective experience. You watch the rubber hand, see the paintbrush stroke it, and simultaneously feel strokes on your real hidden hand. And at first the rubber hand is clearly not yours, is obviously a fake. But as the synchronous stroking continues, something shifts. The rubber hand begins to feel like it could be yours, begins to feel connected, and after several minutes, the feeling is strong. The rubber hand feels like part of your body, and when you're asked to close your eyes and point to where your real hand is, your pointing is shifted toward the rubber hand. You mislocalize your real hand, place it closer to the rubber hand than it actually is, and this proprioceptive drift shows that the body representation has been updated, has incorporated the rubber hand, and the illusion is not just a belief, but is a genuine perceptual shift, a change in how your body feels and where it feels located. The rubber hand illusion demonstrates multisensory integration, shows that the brain combines information from different senses to construct a coherent representation of the body. And when visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals are consistent, they are attributed to the same body part, and the brain updates the body schema accordingly. And the rubber hand, despite being visibly fake, is integrated because the signals are consistent, vision and touch agree, and the brain prioritizes consistency over implausibility, treats the consistent signals as evidence of body ownership, and the illusion reveals that body ownership is not simply given by innate body knowledge, but is actively maintained through continuous multisensory integration, and the boundaries of the body are flexible, can be extended or contracted depending on sensory evidence. Visualize the body schema as a dynamic map, a neural representation of the body's configuration and boundaries, and this map is constantly updated based on sensory input, is adjusted to reflect current body state, and the rubber hand illusion shows that the map can be manipulated, can be made to include external objects, if the right sensory conditions are met. And this flexibility is adaptive, allows the body schema to incorporate tools and prosthetics, allows extension of the sense of embodiment beyond biological boundaries. And the illusion demonstrates this flexibility, shows that a rubber hand can be treated as real, can be incorporated into the body schema, can evoke proprioceptive shifts and emotional responses. The rubber hand illusion has practical applications for prosthetic design, for helping amputees incorporate artificial limbs, for creating prosthetics that feel like part of the body rather than like external tools, and understanding the conditions that produce the illusion, the need for synchronous multisensory stimulation, informs how prosthetics should provide feedback, how they should integrate visual and tactile signals. And the illusion has been used therapeutically, has been adapted to treat phantom limb pain, to help amputees resolve conflicts between visual evidence of absence and proprioceptive evidence of presence, and the techniques developed from studying the illusion have real clinical value. The illusion also has implications for understanding the self, for recognizing that the sense of body ownership is not a simple direct given, but is a constructed representation, is inferred from sensory evidence, and the self, at least the bodily self, is flexible, is not fixed by biological boundaries, and this challenges naive views of the self as a simple unity, as transparently given, and supports views that the self is constructed, is a model built by the brain, and the model can be manipulated, can include or exclude body parts depending on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion shows this manipulation directly, shows that body ownership can be experimentally induced for fake limbs. And this raises questions about personal identity, about what makes a body part yours, about whether ownership is determined by biological connection or by sensory integration, and the illusion suggests the latter. One variant of the rubber hand illusion uses virtual reality, uses computer-generated hands that can be manipulated more precisely than rubber hands, can change appearance, can violate physical constraints, and virtual embodiment studies have shown that people can experience ownership of virtual bodies, can incorporate digital hands into their body schema. And this has applications for VR design, for creating immersive experiences, for understanding how to make virtual avatars feel like real bodies, and the principles discovered through the rubber hand illusion extend to virtual embodiment, show that the same multisensory integration mechanisms apply, and synchronous visuotactile stimulation produces ownership of virtual limbs just as it does for rubber limbs. Another variant explores whether the illusion extends beyond hands, whether legs or whole bodies can be incorporated, and studies have shown that full body illusions are possible, that people can experience ownership of entire mannequin bodies or virtual avatars when appropriate multisensory stimulation is provided. And these full body illusions demonstrate that body ownership is global, applies to the entire body representation, and can be manipulated systematically. And the flexibility of body ownership is even greater than the rubber hand illusion alone suggests, extends to whole body reconfiguration. And this has implications for understanding disorders of body ownership, for understanding phantom limbs and body integrity identity disorder, and for developing therapeutic interventions. The rubber hand sits on the table, fake and obvious, and yet after synchronous stroking, it feels real, feels like part of the body, and the person flinches when it is threatened, responds emotionally and physiologically as though their real hand is in danger. And the illusion reveals that body ownership is constructed, is inferred from multisensory consistency, is flexible and dynamic, and the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are continuously updated based on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in cognitive neuroscience, a phenomenon that challenges assumptions about embodiment, that reveals the constructed nature of the bodily self, and that shows that even the most basic sense, the sense of which body parts are yours, is not simply given but is actively maintained through brain processes that can be fooled, can be manipulated, and the rubber hand becomes real, becomes incorporated, and the illusion persists. The Sorites paradox: a single grain of sand is not a heap, this much seems certain. And adding one grain of sand to something that is not a heap does not suddenly create a heap. One grain cannot make that much difference, and yet if you continue adding grains one by one, at some point you will have a heap, perhaps after 1,000 grains, perhaps 10,000, but surely 1,000,000 grains of sand piled together constitute a heap. And so somewhere in the process of adding individual grains, a heap must have come into existence, but where, after which grain? And this is the Stoicism paradox, named from the Greek word for heap, a puzzle about vague predicates and the boundaries of concepts that has troubled philosophers since ancient times. The paradox can be constructed for almost any vague term. A man with a full head of hair is not bald, and removing one hair does not make a bald man. One hair cannot be the difference between bald and not bald, and yet removing hairs one by one will eventually result in baldness. Or consider a tall person. If someone is tall, then removing 1 millimeter from their height does not make them not tall. 1 millimeter is imperceptible, insignificant, and yet removing millimeters one by one will eventually result in someone who is clearly not tall. And the same pattern applies to colours, to wealth, to age, to nearly every predicate we use in ordinary language. And in each case we are forced to accept either that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of grains or hairs or millimeters that marks the transition, which seems arbitrary and implausible, or that there is no boundary at all, which leads to the absurd conclusion that no amount of sand is a heap, no person is bald, no one is tall, because the reasoning that prevents one grain from making a difference applies equally to every grain. The paradox exposes the vagueness inherent in natural language, the fact that most of our concepts do not have sharp boundaries, but instead fade gradually from clear cases to borderline cases to clear non-cases, and this vagueness creates logical problems, because classical logic assumes that every statement is either true or false, that predicates have determinate extensions, that there is a fact of the matter about whether any given collection of sand grains is a heap. But vague predicates resist this bivalent structure, and the Stoicism paradox forces us to choose between preserving classical logic and accepting sharp boundaries, or rejecting classical logic and developing new logical systems that can handle vagueness. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept that vague predicates have sharp boundaries, that there is a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, even though we do not and perhaps cannot know what that number is. And they argue that this is no more mysterious than other forms of ignorance. That epistemicism, the view that vagueness is ignorance of sharp boundaries, preserves classical logic at the cost of accepting counterintuitive, hidden thresholds. Others reject sharp boundaries and embrace many-valued logic or fuzzy logic, systems where statements can be partially true, where being a heap admits of degrees, where a collection of grains can be somewhat a heap, more of a heap than another collection, but less of a heap than a third, and truth values range continuously from 0 to 1, rather than being restricted to true and false. Still others argue that vague predicates are context-sensitive, that what counts as a heap depends on the purposes and standards operative in a given context. That in some contexts a small pile might count as a heap, while in others only a large pile would. And so there is no absolute fact about heaphood, only relative facts indexed to contexts. The Stoicism paradox also has practical implications. In law, where vague terms like reasonable or substantial must be applied to real cases. In medicine, where diagnoses depend on thresholds that are often vague. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require arbitrary boundaries that the Stoicism reasoning undermines. And in these domains, the paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine challenge to decision-making and judgment. The paradox remains unresolved. Philosophers continue to debate the best response, and it stands as a reminder that the concepts we use to navigate the world, the words we rely on to describe and categorize, are far less precise than we ordinarily assume, that vagueness is pervasive, that boundaries are often illusory, and that the attempt to force the fluid and gradual into the rigid and discrete to impose the structure of classical logic on the messy reality of natural language leads inevitably to paradox, to situations where reasoning breaks down, where every answer seems wrong, and where the heap, like so many things, resists definition. The paradox of non-being, how nothing cannot be talked about. A philosopher attempts to state a simple truth, attempts to say that something does not exist, attempts to assert that unicorns are not real, that they have no being, that they are nothing, and yet stating this seems impossible, seems paradoxical, because to say that unicorns do not exist is to say something about unicorns, is to refer to them, to make them the subject of a statement. And how can you refer to what does not exist? How can you make something the subject of a statement if that something is nothing, if it has no being? And if you can refer to unicorns, then they must be something, must have some kind of being. But then the statement unicorns do not exist is false, is contradictory, because it refers to things that it claims do not exist. And this is the paradox of non-being, first articulated by Plato in the Sophist, the puzzle about how negative existential statements are possible, how we can truly say that something does not exist without contradicting ourselves, without presupposing the existence of what we are denying exists. And this paradox has troubled metaphysics throughout history, has generated multiple solutions, and remains a test case for theories of reference and existence. Imagine trying to deny the existence of something, trying to say that Zeus does not exist, that there is no such God, and the statement seems straightforward, seems obviously true, but analysing the statement reveals problems because the statement is about Zeus, makes Zeus the subject, and subjects of statements must be something, must have reference, must be objects that the statement is about. And if Zeus is the subject, then Zeus must exist in some sense, must be something rather than nothing. But the statement says Zeus does not exist, says Zeus is nothing. And so the statement seems self-refuting, seems to both presuppose and deny the existence of its subject. And this is the paradox, that negative existentials, statements denying existence, seem impossible to state without contradiction. Parmenides made this paradox central to his philosophy, argued that non-being cannot be spoken of or thought about, because speaking and thinking require objects, require that there be something that is spoken of or thought about. And non-being is not something, is nothing. And so non-being is inexpressible, unthinkable. And from this Parmenides concluded that non-being does not exist, that everything that is exists, that reality is one unchanging being, and change is impossible because change would require something to come into being from non-being or to pass into non-being, and both are impossible. And this radical conclusion follows from taking the paradox of non-being seriously, from accepting that we cannot coherently speak of what does not exist. Visualize the paradox as a linguistic trap. When you say X does not exist, you seem to refer to X, and reference requires that X be something, and if X is something, then X exists. And so the statement is self-refuting, and yet negative existentials seem to be true, seem to be among the most basic truths. And we need to explain how they can be true without contradiction, how we can deny existence without presupposing it. And this requires a theory of reference that allows reference to non-existence, or that reinterprets negative existentials so they do not really refer to their apparent subjects. One solution proposed by Russell denies that names like Zeus refer to objects, analyzes them as disguised descriptions, and Zeus does not exist becomes, there is no unique object that has all the properties attributed to Zeus in mythology. And this existential statement does not refer to Zeus, does not presuppose any object, but simply denies that the description is satisfied. And this allows negative existentials to be true, without paradox, without reference to non-existence. And Russell's theory of descriptions has been widely adopted as solving the paradox. as showing that negative existentials do not actually have the logical form they appear to have, do not refer to their apparent subjects. Another solution from free logic distinguishes between existence and reference, allows that terms can refer without presupposing existence, and negative existentials are statements that deny existence while preserving reference, and this requires revising classical logic, requires allowing that some terms refer to nothing, are empty names, and statements containing empty names can still be meaningful, can still have truth values, and Zeus does not exist is true because Zeus is an empty name, refers to nothing, and the statement denies existence without presupposing it. And free logic has been developed extensively, provides formal semantics for empty names, and handles the paradox by liberalizing logic to allow reference without existence. A third solution, from Meinongian approaches, accepts that non-existent objects are real in a broad sense, have being even if they lack existence, and Zeus does not exist is true, because Zeus is a non-existent object, has being but lacks existence, and statements about Zeus refer to this non-existent object, and the paradox is dissolved because reference does not require existence, only requires being, and non-existent objects have being, have properties, can be subjects of true statements, and this solution preserves the intuition that negative existentials refer to their subjects, while denying that reference requires existence. The paradox also appears in discussions of nothingness, of absolute non-being, because to say that absolute nothing is impossible seems to require referring to absolute nothing, making it the subject of a statement, and if it is the subject then it must be something, and so the statement that nothing is impossible presupposes that nothing is something, and this generates contradiction, and Heidegger made this paradox central to his philosophy, explored the nature of nothingness, argued that nothing is not a thing but is the horizon of being, the possibility of non-being that makes being intelligible, and discussing nothing requires special language, requires recognizing that nothing is not an object but is something more fundamental, and the paradox shows limits of ordinary language, shows that metaphysics pushes language beyond its designed capacities. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, accept that there are true contradictions, dialetheas, statements that are both true and false, and negative existentials are examples, are both true because they correctly deny existence, and false because they refer to their subjects, and reference presupposes existence. And this paraconsistent approach accepts contradiction, develops logics that allow true contradictions without explosion, without allowing everything to be provable. And while controversial, paraconsistent logic provides one way of handling the paradox, accepts that negative existentials are genuinely paradoxical, are both true and false. The statement stands: Zeus does not exist, unicorns are not real, nothing is something, and the paradox remains, hovering over negative existentials, challenging theories of reference, forcing recognition that denying existence is not as simple as it seems, that we cannot straightforwardly say that something is nothing without creating logical tension, and the paradox of non-being endures as one of the oldest problems in philosophy, a problem recognized by Plato, central to Parmenides, unresolved by centuries of analysis, and various solutions exist, various ways of dissolving or accepting the paradox, but no consensus emerges, and the paradox persists, a reminder that language struggles to express non-existence, that negation creates puzzles, and that the boundary between being and non-being resists clear articulation. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions. And if democracy respects majority, well, it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction. But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy: the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times, was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice: honor the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice: preserve procedure or preserve substance, respect majority, will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will, and these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority. And this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible, and historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level and democratic procedures at another, and procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival, and different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance, a challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy, and the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The paradox of fiction: why we cry for people who don't exist. A person sits in a dark theatre watching a film, and on the screen a character faces tragedy, loses a loved one, experiences betrayal, suffers deeply, and the person watching feels genuine emotion, feels sadness, feels tears forming, feels the physiological responses of grief. And yet the person knows that what is happening on screen is not real, knows that the characters are fictional, that no one actually died, that the suffering is pretend, is mere actors following a script in front of cameras. And this creates a puzzle, because emotions seem to require beliefs, seem to depend on thinking that something is really happening, that genuine harm or loss has occurred. And if you do not believe something is real, then you should not have emotional responses to it. And yet, fiction produces powerful emotions, despite the audience knowing it is fiction. And this is the paradox of fiction, articulated by Colin Radford and others. The question of how we can be moved by what we know to be false, how we can fear for characters we know do not exist, how we can grieve losses we know never happened. And the paradox challenges our understanding of emotion, raises questions about the relationship between belief and feeling, and forces recognition that emotional responses are more complex than simple belief response models suggest. Imagine watching a horror film, a scene where the protagonist is chased by a monster, and your heart races, adrenaline surges, you feel fear, genuine fear, and yet you know you are safe. Know you are sitting in a theatre, know that no monster exists, that the events on screen are fabricated, and if fear requires believing you are in danger, then you should not feel fear, should remain calm, should watch with detachment, but you do not. You respond emotionally, despite knowing the fiction is not real, and this emotional engagement is not a mistake, not a failure of rationality, but is how fiction works, how stories affect us. And the paradox asks how this is possible, how belief and emotion relate when they seem to come apart in cases of fiction. The paradox can be formulated as three inconsistent claims. First, we have emotional responses to fictional characters and events. We cry at sad movies, laugh at comedies, feel suspense in thrillers, and this is undeniable. Second, emotional responses require beliefs about the reality of their objects. You cannot fear something you know does not threaten you, cannot grieve something you know did not happen. Emotions are directed at states of affairs we believe obtain. And third, we do not believe fictional characters and events are real. We know they are fictional, know that no one is actually in danger, that no loss actually occurred. And these three claims are inconsistent. Any two imply the negation of the third, and resolving the paradox requires rejecting or modifying one of them. Visualize the emotional response as a two-stage process. First comes the perception or imagination of a situation, seeing the character in danger, imagining their suffering, and second comes the emotion, the fear or sadness or joy, and normally these two stages are connected through belief. You perceive danger and believe it is real, and this causes fear. But in fiction, the connection is different. You perceive or imagine danger, but do not believe it is real, and yet fear occurs anyway. And the paradox asks what mediates the connection in fiction, if not belief. One response denies the second claim, argues that emotions do not require beliefs, that emotional responses can be triggered by perceptions or imaginings without requiring that we believe what we perceive or imagine is real, and this response treats emotions as more primitive than beliefs, as responses that evolved to deal with immediate situations and that can be activated by representations even when we know those representations are not real. And fiction works by hijacking these emotional systems, by presenting stimuli that trigger emotional responses directly without requiring belief. And so we fear fictional monsters, because our fear system responds to the representation of danger even when we know the danger is fictional. Another response modifies the first claim, argues that the emotions we feel toward fiction are not genuine emotions, but quasi-emotions, pale imitations of real emotions that lack certain components. And when we cry at a movie, we are not really sad, not in the way we would be sad if the events were real, but we are experiencing something similar, a simulation or shadow of sadness. And this quasi-emotion does not require belief because it is not the full genuine article, and this response preserves the connection between belief and genuine emotion while explaining fiction through a different kind of response that resembles emotion without being emotion. A third response, associated with Kendall Walton, appeals to imaginative engagement, argues that when we engage with fiction, we make believe. We imagine that the fictional events are real, and our emotional responses are responses to what we imagine rather than to what we believe. And imagination can trigger emotional responses without requiring belief, can produce fear and sadness and joy through imagined scenarios. And fiction invites us to imagine certain things, and our emotions follow from these imaginings. And this response treats make-believe as a distinct cognitive mode, different from both belief and mere perception. A mode that can generate emotions without requiring that we believe the imagined content is real. The paradox also raises questions about the function of fiction, about why we engage with fictional narratives, why we subject ourselves to emotions triggered by events we know are not real. And various answers have been proposed. Perhaps fiction allows us to explore possibilities, to experience situations vicariously, to rehearse emotional responses in safe contexts. Perhaps it serves social functions, helps us understand others, builds empathy, creates shared experiences, or perhaps it provides aesthetic pleasure, the enjoyment of well-crafted narratives, regardless of their truth. And understanding why fiction moves us might help explain how it moves us, might reveal the mechanisms that connect fictional representations to emotional responses. The paradox extends beyond fiction to other representational arts, to paintings that depict scenes that never occurred, to music that evokes emotions without representing anything, to imaginative scenarios we generate ourselves when daydreaming or planning. And in all these cases, emotions arise without corresponding beliefs about reality. And this suggests that the relationship between emotion and belief is more flexible than the paradox assumes, that emotions can be triggered in multiple ways, through beliefs about reality, but also through perceptions, imaginings, representations, and stimuli that engage our emotional systems directly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals important truths about the nature of emotion, that emotions are not simply cognitive responses to believed states of affairs, but are complex phenomena involving perception, imagination, physiological arousal, and behavioral dispositions. And these components can dissociate, can come apart, and in fiction, we have the perceptual and imaginative components without the belief component, and this dissociation produces emotional responses that are real but not fully equivalent to emotions directed at reality. And so the paradox is not a problem to solve, but a feature to explain, a demonstration of the complexity of emotional life. The theatre darkens, the film plays, the character suffers, and the audience cries, knowing it is fiction, yet moved nonetheless. And the paradox remains a puzzle about how art affects us, how representation produces emotion, how we can care about what we know does not exist, and the tears are real even though their object is not. And this strange combination, this ability to be moved by acknowledged fiction, is central to human experience, is what makes stories powerful, makes art meaningful, makes imagination a source of feeling as potent as reality. And the paradox endures, unresolved in the sense that no consensus solution has emerged. No account of emotion and fiction that satisfies all philosophers, only a recognition that fiction moves us, that we respond emotionally to representations, that imagination and emotion are deeply connected, and that the relationship between belief and feeling is more complex than we thought. And the paradox persists as a reminder that human psychology is subtle, that cognitive and emotional systems interact in non-obvious ways, and that the ability to be moved by fiction, far from being a problem or a mistake, is a capacity that enriches life, that allows us to experience more than our immediate circumstances, to feel for others, to explore possibilities, and to find meaning in stories we know are not true. The paradox of choice, why having everything makes us want nothing. A shopper stands in the cereal aisle of a modern supermarket, surrounded by hundreds of options, dozens of brands, each offering multiple varieties, chocolate cereals and fruit cereals and granola and organic options and sugar-free options and high-fiber options. And the shopper came with a simple goal: to buy cereal, but now faces a wall of choices, and minutes pass. Then more minutes, as the shopper reads labels, compares prices, weighs nutritional content against taste preferences, and the simple task becomes exhausting, becomes overwhelming, and eventually the shopper either picks something randomly just to escape the aisle, or leaves without buying anything at all, paralyzed by too many options. And this is the paradox of choice, articulated by psychologist Barry Schwartz. The observation that while having some choice is better than having none, having too many choices can actually make us worse off, can lead to decision paralysis, anxiety, dissatisfaction, and regret. And this paradox challenges the assumption that more freedom and more options always lead to better outcomes, suggests instead that there is an optimal amount of choice beyond which additional options become burdensome rather than beneficial. Imagine living in a world with few choices, a small village where there is one type of bread, one kind of shoe, limited options for occupation and lifestyle, and people generally wear what everyone wears, eat what everyone eats, follow the paths that tradition provides. And this limited choice can feel constraining, can prevent people from finding what truly suits them, can force them into roles and lifestyles that do not fit, but it also simplifies life, reduces the cognitive burden of decision-making, provides clear social scripts and expectations, and people in such societies often report high satisfaction because expectations are managed, because the gap between what they have and what they could have is small. And now contrast this with modern, affluent societies where choice proliferates endlessly, where every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to what career to pursue, involves navigating vast option spaces. And while this freedom allows for personalization, allows people to find exactly what they want, it also creates anxiety, creates the constant question of whether a better option exists, whether the choice made was optimal. And this anxiety erodes satisfaction even when the chosen option is good, because the existence of unchosen alternatives haunts a decision. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First is decision paralysis. When faced with too many options, the cognitive load of evaluating them becomes overwhelming. And rather than carefully comparing all options, people either make hasty decisions to escape the complexity or defer the decision entirely, avoid choosing at all. And this is why offering more product varieties can sometimes decrease sales, why adding options can reduce rather than increase engagement, because each additional option adds to the burden of decision-making, and at some point the burden exceeds the benefit and people opt out. Second is regret and second-guessing. When there are many options and you choose one, the existence of all the unchosen options creates opportunity for regret, creates the thought that perhaps one of the other options would have been better, and this regret is stronger when there are more alternatives because each alternative represents a path not taken, a potential source of better outcomes. And so the chosen option must compete not just with reality, but with imagination, with idealized versions of what the unchosen options might have provided, and actual outcomes rarely exceed these idealized counterfactuals. And so satisfaction decreases even when the choice is good, and this effect is amplified when choices are reversible, when you can change your mind, because reversibility keeps all options perpetually open, prevents commitment, prevents the psychological closure that comes from accepting a decision as final. Third is the escalation of expectations. When there are few options, we expect less. We accept what is available and feel grateful if it is good. But when there are many options, we expect to find exactly what we want, expect the perfect fit, and our standards rise. And this rising threshold means that good outcomes feel merely adequate rather than excellent. And satisfaction depends not on absolute quality, but on the gap between expectations and reality. and more choice raises expectations faster than it improves outcomes. And so, the net effect is decreased satisfaction, despite better products and more freedom. Visualize a graph with number of options on one axis and satisfaction on the other, and the relationship is not linear but inverted U-shaped. Satisfaction rises as options increase from 0 to some moderate number, perhaps 5 or 10, because having some choice allows people to find something that fits their preferences. But beyond that optimal point, satisfaction begins to decline, and at very high numbers of options, satisfaction may even fall below the level experienced with minimal choice, because the cognitive and emotional costs of choosing exceed the benefits of additional options. And this inverted U captures the paradox, shows that more is not always better, that optimization requires moderation, that there is such a thing as too much freedom. The paradox has practical implications for product design, marketing, and policy. Companies that offer too many products may overwhelm customers and reduce sales, while companies that curate their offerings, that limit choice to a manageable set of high-quality options, may increase satisfaction and loyalty. And this is why successful brands often limit their product lines, why Apple offers relatively few models compared to competitors, why some restaurants have short menus. The limitation is not a failure, but a strategy, a recognition that customers benefit from being protected from too much choice, from having the decision space narrowed by experts who have already done the filtering. The paradox also affects personal life and well-being. Modern individuals face an unprecedented number of choices about identity, lifestyle, career, relationships, and consumption. And while this freedom is liberating in principle, in practice it can be exhausting, can create a sense of being overwhelmed, can generate anxiety about missing out on better options, and research shows that people in societies with more choice are not necessarily happier, that reported life satisfaction has not increased proportionally with the explosion of options, and some argue it has decreased, that the paradox of choice contributes to rising rates of anxiety and depression, that the burden of constructing a life from infinite options without clear guidance is a source of modern malaise. One response to the paradox is to adopt satisficing rather than maximizing as a decision strategy. Maximizers seek the best option, the optimal choice, and this requires evaluating all possibilities, comparing exhaustively, and the process is endless because there is always the possibility that a better option exists somewhere. While satisficers set a threshold of good enough and choose the first option that meets that threshold, and satisficers experience less stress, less regret, and higher satisfaction because they commit to good options without torturing themselves about whether better options exist. And embracing satisficing is a way to opt out of the paradox, to limit self-imposed choice burden even when external options are numerous. Another response is to establish routines and defaults, to make decisions once and then follow the decision automatically in the future, to reduce the number of active choices required. And this is why successful people often simplify their lives, wear the same clothes every day, eat the same breakfast, follow the same schedule, not because they lack creativity, but because they recognize that decision-making is a limited resource, that every choice consumes cognitive energy, and preserving that energy for important decisions requires eliminating trivial choices through routinization. A third response is to embrace constraints, to deliberately limit options, to refuse to consider all possibilities, and this might involve setting rules like, I only shop at this store, or I only consider jobs in this city, and these self-imposed constraints reduce the choice space, make decisions more manageable, and paradoxically increase freedom by preventing paralysis, by ensuring that decisions get made rather than deferred indefinitely. And constraints are not limitations on freedom, but conditions for effective exercise of freedom, structures that enable choice rather than preventing it. The shopper stands in the cereal aisle, paralyzed by options, and eventually walks away empty-handed, or grabs something arbitrarily, and the experience is repeated across modern life, in career choices and relationship decisions and consumption patterns, and the paradox persists. More choice leading to less satisfaction, more freedom creating more anxiety. And Schwartz's insight remains relevant, challenges the ideology of unlimited choice, suggests that well-being requires moderation, requires protection from too much optionality, and the paradox endures as a reminder that freedom is complex, that having options is valuable, but that value has limits, that beyond a certain point additional options become burdens rather than benefits. And the challenge for individuals and societies is to find the optimal level of choice, the sweet spot where there is enough freedom to allow for genuine self-determination, but not so much that the burden of choosing overwhelms the benefit of having chosen. And the paradox remains a feature of modern affluent societies, a price paid for abundance, and a problem that requires not more choice but wiser choice, not more options but better frameworks for navigating options. And the cereal aisle waits, endless and overwhelming, and the shopper eventually learns to bring a list to decide in advance, to opt out of the paradox by refusing to treat every shopping trip as an opportunity for exhaustive optimization. The paradox of the court, when a student's promise becomes impossible to keep. An ancient story tells of a law teacher named Protagoras and his student Euathlus, and they make an agreement. The student is too poor to pay tuition up front, and so they agree that the student will pay the teacher after winning his first court case, and the teacher provides instruction, teaches the student rhetoric and law and argumentation, and the student completes his training, becomes skilled in legal reasoning, but then the student never takes a case, never appears in court, never wins anything, and years pass and the teacher has not been paid, and finally the teacher sues the student, takes him to court to demand payment. And now the paradox emerges because the case creates a logical impossibility, a situation where no judgment can be coherent, where the law contradicts itself. And this is the paradox of the court, also called Protagoras' paradox, a puzzle about legal reasoning, contracts, and self-reference that has no satisfactory solution. Imagine the trial. The teacher presents his case, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will order the student to pay, and the student will be legally obligated to pay the agreed tuition, and second that if he loses the lawsuit, then the student has won his first case, and according to the original agreement, the student must pay after winning his first case, and so, either way, the student must pay, whether the court rules for the teacher or for the student. The contract ensures payment, and this argument seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot avoid payment, that filing the lawsuit was a clever move, that forces the student into a position where any outcome requires payment. But now the student, trained in rhetoric by the teacher himself, presents a counter-argument of equal force, arguing first that if he wins the lawsuit, then the court will rule in his favour, and he will not be legally obligated to pay, and second that if he loses the lawsuit, then he has not won his first case, and according to the original agreement, he only pays after winning his first case, and so either way, he does not have to pay. Whether the court rules for him or against him, the contract protects him from payment, and this argument also seems impeccable, seems to show that the student cannot be forced to pay, that the lawsuit was a mistake that creates a situation where no outcome requires payment. Visualize the judge sitting in court, listening to both arguments, recognizing that both are logically valid, both follow from the premises, both reach opposite conclusions, and the judge must render a verdict, must decide whether the student pays or does not pay. But any decision seems arbitrary, seems to violate logic, because if the judge rules for the teacher, then the student wins his first case and does not have to pay, according to the contract. And if the judge rules for the student, then the student loses and does have to pay, according to the contract. And so, the judge's decision determines the opposite of what it declares, creates a self-contradicting outcome, and the law becomes incoherent, and the case cannot be decided without paradox. The paradox reveals a problem with self-referential contracts, contracts whose terms depend on the outcome of litigation about those very terms, because such contracts create loops, create situations where the contract's fulfillment depends on whether the contract is enforced, and whether it is enforced depends on whether it is fulfilled. And this circular dependency generates contradictions, makes it impossible to apply the law consistently, and the paradox shows that some contracts, even if agreed to voluntarily by competent parties, are legally unenforceable. Not because they violate public policy or lack consideration, but because they are logically incoherent, because no court can implement them without contradiction. One proposed resolution is to distinguish between two different questions: the question of whether the student owes the teacher money according to the contract, and the question of whether the court should order the student to pay, and these are separate issues. The contract might create an obligation that the court nonetheless refuses to enforce, and the court could rule in favour of the student on the narrow question of whether the lawsuit succeeds, while still recognising that the student has a moral obligation under the contract to pay once he wins his first case elsewhere. And this resolution separates legal enforcement from contractual obligation, allows both arguments to be partially correct. The teacher is right that the student owes money, the student is right that the court should not order payment, and the paradox dissolves because the two contradictory outcomes apply to different questions. Another resolution appeals to temporal priority, arguing that the lawsuit itself does not count as the student's first case for purposes of the contract, because the contract was made before the lawsuit, and counting the lawsuit as the first case would mean the contract refers to itself, which creates the paradox. And so the court should interpret the contract as referring to the first case other than the lawsuit about the contract itself. And under this interpretation, if the teacher wins the lawsuit, the student must pay, because the lawsuit is not the first case that triggers payment. And if the student wins the lawsuit, the student does not pay, because the student still has not won a first case other than this one. And the paradox is resolved by excluding self-referential applications of the contract terms. A third resolution argues that the contract is void, because it is impossible to perform, because there is no possible world where the terms are satisfied without contradiction, and impossible contracts are unenforceable, and so the judge should declare the contract void and dismiss the case, leaving the student with no legal obligation, but perhaps a moral obligation to pay the teacher for services rendered. And this resolution sacrifices the contract to preserve logical coherence, treats the paradox as showing that the agreement was fatally flawed from the beginning. The paradox also raises questions about the limits of freedom of contract, about whether parties should be allowed to make any agreement they choose, or whether law should refuse to enforce agreements that are logically incoherent. And most legal systems recognize some limits, refuse to enforce contracts that are impossible, illegal, or against public policy, and the paradox of the court suggests adding logical coherence as another limit, another requirement for enforceability. And this means that contracting parties cannot create obligations that are self-referentially paradoxical, cannot make agreements whose terms depend on their own enforcement in ways that generate contradictions. The paradox has modern analogues in cases involving conditional gifts and trusts, where someone leaves property to another person on condition that the recipient perform some act. And if the act is defined in terms of legal outcomes about the gift itself, then paradoxes can arise, similar to the ancient case of the teacher and student, and courts have developed various doctrines to handle these cases, generally interpreting conditions to avoid self-reference, to prevent the kind of logical loops that the paradox of the court exemplifies. The courtroom stands empty, the ancient case unresolved, the judge unable to render coherent judgment, and the paradox remains a teaching tool in logic and law, an illustration of how self-reference creates problems, how circular definitions generate contradictions, and how even voluntary agreements between competent parties can be unenforceable if their structure is logically incoherent. And Protagoras and Euathlus remain frozen in their dispute, both right and both wrong, both entitled to payment and entitled to refuse payment. And the paradox persists as a reminder that logic constrains law, that not everything that can be agreed to can be enforced, and that self-reference, whether in contracts or in statements or in rules, is a source of paradox that must be handled carefully to avoid contradiction. The Simpsons paradox. A pharmaceutical company tests a new drug, comparing it to an existing treatment, and the study involves two populations, men and women, and when the results are analysed separately by gender, the new drug outperforms the old treatment in both groups. Men who take the new drug recover more frequently than men who take the old treatment, and women who take the new drug also recover more frequently than women who take the old treatment. And so it seems clear that the new drug is superior, effective for both men and women, better than the alternative, and yet when the data from both groups are combined, when the overall recovery rates are calculated across the entire study population, the old treatment appears to outperform the new drug, showing higher overall recovery rates. And this reversal, where a trend that holds in every subgroup disappears or reverses when the subgroups are combined, is Simpson's paradox, named after the statistician Edward Simpson, who described it formally in 1951, though the phenomenon had been noted earlier by others. And the paradox reveals how aggregating data can mislead, how the whole can tell a different story than the parts, and how statistical reasoning requires careful attention to confounding variables and the structure of causal relationships. The resolution of the paradox lies in understanding that the populations are not balanced, that more men than women take the new drug, or more women than men take the old treatment, or that the recovery rates differ between genders for reasons unrelated to the drugs. And this imbalance means that the overall average is dominated by the group with higher representation. And if men have higher recovery rates in general, and most men take the new drug, then the new drug will appear effective overall, even if it is actually less effective than the old treatment when gender is controlled for. Or if the distribution is skewed in other ways, the opposite reversal can occur. And the paradox shows that crude averages can be misleading. That Simpson's paradox occurs whenever there is a lurking variable, a confounding factor that influences both the treatment assignment and the outcome, and failing to account for this variable leads to incorrect conclusions. Consider a simpler example involving college admissions. Suppose a university has two departments, and Department A admits 70% of applicants, while Department B admits 30%. And when applications are examined by gender, it appears that the university discriminates against women, because the overall acceptance rate for women is lower than for men. But when the data are broken down by department, a different picture emerges. In Department A, which is less selective, a higher percentage of female applicants are admitted than male applicants, and in Department B, which is more selective, the same is true. Women are admitted at higher rates than men in both departments, and the overall appearance of discrimination arises because more women apply to Department B, which has a lower acceptance rate, while more men apply to Department A, which has a higher acceptance rate. And so even though women are favoured in both departments, they appear disfavoured overall. And this is Simpson's paradox. The confounding variable is the choice of department, which correlates with both gender and acceptance rate. And ignoring this variable produces a misleading aggregate statistic. The paradox has profound implications for how we interpret statistical data, for medical research where treatment effects can appear or disappear depending on how data are aggregated, for social science where trends in subgroups can reverse when combined, for legal cases where evidence of discrimination or bias can seem to vanish or appear depending on how populations are divided. And the paradox shows that there is no neutral or objective way to report statistics, that the choice of whether to aggregate or disaggregate, whether to control for certain variables or not, is a substantive decision that affects what conclusions can be drawn, and this decision should be guided by causal understanding, by knowledge of which variables are confounders and which are mediators. And this knowledge cannot be derived from the statistics alone, but requires background theory, domain expertise, and careful thinking about causal structure. Simpson's paradox also raises questions about the nature of causation and the relationship between correlation and causation, because the paradox shows that correlations can reverse when additional variables are considered, that associations in data are sensitive to what is held constant and what is allowed to vary, and this means that identifying causal relationships from observational data is more difficult than it might seem, that confounders must be identified and controlled for, that causal inference requires not just statistical analysis but causal modelling, the specification of hypotheses about how variables influence each other, and the paradox is one reason why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for establishing causation, because randomization ensures that treatment assignment is independent of confounding variables, breaking the associations that generate Simpson's paradox. The paradox appears in many real-world contexts. In sports statistics, where a player can have a better batting average than another player in every season, yet a worse average over their entire career, because they played different numbers of games in different seasons. In economic data, where wages can increase for every demographic group, yet average wages can decrease overall, because the composition of the workforce shifts toward lower wage groups. In epidemiology, where a treatment can appear harmful overall, yet beneficial in every subgroup, because sicker patients are more likely to receive the treatment, and in each case the paradox reveals the danger of naive data interpretation, the risk of drawing conclusions from aggregate statistics without understanding the underlying structure. Some philosophers and statisticians argue that Simpson's paradox is not really a paradox, but a reminder of the importance of causal thinking, that the appearance of paradox arises only when we treat statistical associations as if they were causal relationships, that once we distinguish between correlation and causation, between conditional independence and causal independence, the paradox dissolves, and the correct answer to whether the new drug is better than the old treatment depends on the causal structure, on whether gender is a confounder that should be controlled for, or a mediator that should not be, and this depends on the mechanisms by which the drugs work and the reasons why gender affects recovery rates. Simpson's paradox has also been used to critique certain statistical practices, to question the use of aggregate statistics in policymaking, to highlight the need for transparent reporting of how data are broken down and what variables are controlled for, and to emphasize that statistical analysis is not a neutral technical exercise, but involves interpretive choices that reflect background assumptions and values, and different choices can support different conclusions, even from the same data. And this does not mean that statistics are arbitrary or that all interpretations are equally valid, but it does mean that statistical reasoning requires judgment, requires thinking about causal mechanisms, requires transparency about methods, and requires humility about the limits of what data alone can tell us. The data sit in tables, broken down by subgroups, aggregated across populations, and the numbers tell different stories depending on how they are arranged. And Simpson's paradox reminds us that statistics are not self-interpreting, that averages can mislead, that trends can reverse, and that understanding data requires more than calculation, requires causal reasoning, domain knowledge, and careful attention to structure. And the paradox persists as a warning, a puzzle that appears in textbook examples and real-world disasters, a reminder that numbers lie, or rather that we lie to ourselves when we treat numbers as transparent windows onto reality rather than as constructed representations that must be interpreted with care. And the reversal of trends continues to surprise, continues to catch analysts off guard, continues to generate misleading headlines and faulty policies, and Simpson's paradox endures, not because the mathematics is obscure, but because the temptation to aggregate, to simplify, to collapse complex data into simple averages is overwhelming, and the paradox stands as a permanent challenge to that temptation, a proof that simplification can distort, that the whole is not always the sum of the parts, and that statistical reasoning, done properly, requires vigilance, sophistication, and an understanding of causation that transcends mere correlation. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real, and this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have two incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation, cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason. that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments, and Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties, and Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle, and so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios. That knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigate between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, while the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. The Raven paradox, another name for the same strange logic. The paradox stands at the intersection of logic and intuition, bearing multiple names but always presenting the same fundamental puzzle. And the raven paradox is simply another term for what Hempel called the paradox of confirmation, the same logical structure, the same counterintuitive conclusion that observing non-black non-ravens confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. And the paradox is named after ravens because this particular example, chosen somewhat arbitrarily, has become the standard formulation, the canonical case study in discussions of confirmation theory. And ravens serve as the perfect illustration because the hypothesis all ravens are black is simple, clear, empirically testable, and the conclusion that red apples provide evidence for this hypothesis is maximally counterintuitive. And so the raven paradox persists as a permanent fixture in philosophy of science, a problem that every theory of confirmation must address, a test case that separates adequate theories from inadequate ones. The paradox reveals something deep about the nature of scientific reasoning, about how we move from observations to generalizations, from data to theories, and the lesson is that confirmation cannot be understood purely formally, cannot be reduced to logical rules applied mechanically, but requires judgment, requires taking into account background knowledge, context, relevance, and the structure of inquiry. And different philosophical traditions respond differently. Bayesians appeal to prior probabilities and degrees of belief. Falsificationists focus on potential refutation rather than positive confirmation. And pragmatists emphasize the goals and methods of actual scientific practice, and each approach offers tools for handling the paradox, for explaining why ravens matter and apples do not despite the logical equivalence. And the paradox serves as a crucible, a test that theories of confirmation must pass. And many theories that seem plausible initially reveal inadequacies when confronted with the raven paradox, fail to explain our intuitions, force counterintuitive conclusions, or require abandoning principles that seem essential to scientific reasoning. Visualize a scientist designing an experiment to test whether all ravens are black, and the scientist must decide what to observe, where to look, what data to collect, and the obvious choice is to find ravens and check their colour, to go where ravens live and observe them systematically. And no scientist would waste time observing apples or examining non-ravens, not because such observations are irrelevant in principle, but because they are inefficient, provide so little information relative to the effort required that they're not worth doing. And this practical irrelevance, this decision based on efficiency rather than logic, is what our intuitions track. And the paradox arises from confusing practical irrelevance with logical irrelevance, from thinking that because we should not observe apples in practice, apples must not provide confirmation in principle. And once we separate these two senses of relevance, the paradox loses some of its force, becomes less paradoxical, becomes a lesson about the difference between what logically confirms a hypothesis and what constitutes good scientific practice. The raven paradox also illustrates the problem of GRU, the challenge of projectable predicates, because just as we face questions about what confirms hypotheses, we also face questions about which generalizations are legitimate, which patterns can be projected into the future. And these two problems are connected. Both involve understanding how observation relates to theory, how particular instances support general claims. And the raven paradox is one manifestation of the broader problem of induction, the problem of justifying our inferences from observed to unobserved cases. And solving the raven paradox completely would require solving the problem of induction, would require explaining how evidence works, how observation justifies belief. And this larger project remains incomplete, remains one of philosophy's central unsolved problems. The paradox endures because it is simple, because it uses everyday examples that everyone understands, ravens and apples and colours, and yet produces a conclusion that seems absurd, that violates common sense, And this combination makes it pedagogically powerful, makes it an excellent tool for teaching about confirmation and scientific method, for showing students that logic can lead to surprising places, that formal reasoning sometimes conflicts with intuition, and that philosophy of science is not obvious, not a matter of codifying what scientists already know, but involves genuine puzzles that require careful analysis to resolve. And the Raven paradox remains a standard topic in introductory courses, a problem that every student of philosophy of science encounters. And despite decades of discussion, despite hundreds of papers and books addressing it, the paradox retains its power to surprise, to challenge, to force recognition that confirmation is more subtle than it appears. The ravens fly, black against the sky, and somewhere a scientist notes another black raven, records it as confirming evidence, and elsewhere someone observes a red apple, and logic says this too is evidence about ravens. This too confirms the hypothesis, and the paradox persists, a challenge to our understanding of how evidence works. A puzzle that remains unsolved, not because no solutions have been proposed, but because every solution requires sacrificing some intuition, requires accepting some counterintuitive conclusion, or rejecting some seemingly obvious principle. And the paradox stands as a reminder that scientific method is not straightforward, that the relationship between theory and observation is complex, and that even basic questions about confirmation, about what counts as evidence, about how we learn from experience, remain philosophically problematic, and the Raven paradox endures. The ship of Theseus. A ship returns to harbour after a long voyage, its wooden planks weathered and damaged by storms and salt. And the repairs begin. One plank is removed and replaced with new wood, then another, and over months or years every single plank, every beam, every nail is replaced until nothing of the original materials remains. And yet it is still called the ship of Theseus, still registered under the same name, still captained by the same crew, and the question arises, is it the same ship or a different ship? And if it is different, when did it become different? After the first plank was replaced, or the 10th, or the last, and where is the boundary between identity and change? The paradox is ancient, discussed by Greek and Roman philosophers, and it strikes at the heart of what it means for an object to persist through time, to remain itself despite losing and gaining parts. And the problem deepens when a second scenario is introduced. Imagine that all the original planks removed from the ship of Theseus are collected and stored, and then using only those original materials, a second ship is built, an exact replica assembled from the very wood that once formed the ship of Theseus. And now there are two ships, one that has been continuously repaired and one that is made entirely of the original materials. And which one is the true ship of Theseus, the one with continuity of form and function, or the one with continuity of material? The paradox has no clear answer, and different philosophical traditions offer different responses. Some argue that identity is determined by material composition, that an object is the sum of its parts, and so the ship made from original planks is the true ship of Theseus, even though it was disassembled and reassembled, while others argue that identity is determined by form and function, that what makes the ship is its structure and purpose, and so the continuously repaired ship retains its identity, even though none of its original material remains. Still others suggest that identity is conventional, a matter of social agreement and practical convenience, that there is no objective fact about which ship is the real ship of Theseus, only a question of what we choose to call it based on our needs and conventions. The paradox extends beyond ships to living organisms because the cells in the human body are constantly dying and being replaced. And over a period of years, almost every atom in the body is exchanged with the environment. And yet a person is considered the same person throughout their life. And so, what makes identity persist? Is it continuity of consciousness, continuity of memory, continuity of physical form, or something else entirely. The problem also appears in legal and ethical contexts, questions about personal responsibility over time, whether a person who has changed dramatically is still accountable for actions committed decades earlier, whether a corporation that has replaced all its employees and assets is still the same entity bound by old contracts, whether a nation that has undergone revolution and transformation retains the obligations of its former government. Some philosophers embrace a four-dimensionalist view, arguing that objects are not three-dimensional things that persist through time, but four-dimensional space-time worms, extended through time as well as space, and that what we call the ship of Theseus is really a temporally extended object, a continuous path through space-time, and the question of identity becomes a question of how we slice that four-dimensional object into temporal parts. Others reject this view, insisting that objects exist wholly at each moment, that the ship of Theseus at one time is numerically identical to the ship of Theseus at another time, if there is the right kind of continuity between them, though what counts as the right kind of continuity remains disputed. The ship of Theseus paradox remains unsolved, a puzzle that philosophy has examined for over 2 millennia without reaching consensus, and it stands as a reminder that identity, persistence, and change are not as straightforward as they seem, that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is one of the deepest and most difficult in metaphysics, and that the world we navigate, full of objects and people and institutions that seem to endure, may be far more fluid and ambiguous than common sense suggests. The problem of the one, why nothing can be truly unified. A philosopher asks the opposite question, not why there are many where we expect one, but why there is one where we observe many, asks how parts compose wholes, how multiplicity becomes unity, how many things can constitute one thing, and this is the problem of the one, the puzzle about unity, about what makes a collection of parts into a genuine single object rather than merely a plurality. And the problem is ancient, goes back to Greek philosophy, to debates about whether wholes are real or are merely conceptual constructions from parts. And the puzzle is that unity seems to require something beyond mere collection, requires a principle of unity that binds parts together. But what could this principle be? What makes a collection of atoms a person, rather than merely atoms arranged person-wise? What makes a ship rather than merely planks fastened together? And if unity is not explained by parts alone, then what explains it? And if unity is just conceptual, just imposed by our minds, then objects are not real, are not mind-independent, and reality consists only of parts, of fundamental particles, and all composition is conventional. And this threatens ordinary ontology, threatens the reality of familiar objects. And this is the problem of the one, the challenge to explain how genuine unity arises from multiplicity, how the one emerges from the many. Imagine a statue, a bronze sculpture of a human figure, and ask what the statue is, and one answer says the statue is a collection of bronze atoms arranged statue-wise. The atoms are parts and the statue is the whole. They compose. But what makes this collection a statue rather than merely atoms? What unifies the atoms into one object? And the answer cannot be just spatial proximity, because atoms separated by empty space are still separate, not unified. And the answer cannot be just causal interaction, because atoms in different objects interact causally, through electromagnetic forces, without composing a single object. And the answer seems to require something additional, a principle of unity, a form in Aristotelian terms, or a substance in Cartesian terms, something that binds parts into wholes. But this additional element is mysterious, is not itself a physical part, and positing it seems like mysterious ontology, and avoiding it seems to require denying that wholes exist, accepting mereological nihilism, the view that only simples exist, only fundamental particles, and composition never occurs, and all talk of composite objects is loose speaking, is convenient fiction. The problem of the one connects to debates about composition, about when parts compose wholes, about what conditions must be met for composition to occur, and the problem is that every proposed answer seems either too permissive, allows too many compositions, allows arbitrary collections to count as objects, or too restrictive, disallows too many compositions, eliminates familiar objects, and finding the right balance, the correct answer to when composition occurs, has proven impossible, and Peter van Inwagen argued that this impossibility suggests composition rarely occurs, perhaps only when parts constitute living organisms, and ordinary inanimate objects do not exist, are not genuine wholes, are only simples arranged object-wise. And this revisionary ontology preserves unity for organisms, but eliminates most ordinary objects. And critics find this too extreme, too counterintuitive, too willing to deny the obvious existence of chairs and tables and planets. Visualize unity as a relation between parts that binds them into wholes. And the question is, what grounds this relation? What makes it obtain? And if the relation is fundamental, not reducible to other facts about parts, then we have expanded our ontology, have added relations to our list of basic entities. And if the relation is reducible, is just parts having certain properties, or standing in certain spatial or causal relations, then we can eliminate talk of wholes, can replace it with talk of parts and their relations, and the whole is not an additional entity but is just the parts and relations described collectively. And this eliminativist approach solves the problem of the one by denying that unified wholes exist, accepting that only parts exist and unity is conceptual, is our way of organizing parts into groups. And objects are not discovered but constructed by our practices of grouping and naming. One response to the problem of the one embraces mereological universalism, argues that any parts whatsoever compose a whole, that composition always occurs, that for any collection of objects, no matter how disparate, there is a further object that they compose. And this position accepts vast ontology, accepts that there are objects, like the fusion of your left hand and the Eiffel Tower, bizarre, scattered objects that common sense would reject. And the advantage is that composition is simple, unrestricted, explained by a single principle. But the disadvantage is that most composite objects are not recognized by ordinary thought, are not natural kinds, are arbitrary fusions, and this threatens to make ontology too easy, too unconstrained, accepts too much rather than too little. Another response accepts that some compositions occur and others do not, that there are principal distinctions, that organisms compose wholes but arbitrary collections do not, that bonding or causation or functional integration grounds composition determines when parts unify into wholes, and this moderate position preserves ordinary objects, accepts that chairs and organisms exist while rejecting bizarre fusions. And the challenge is to state the principle precisely, to say exactly which compositions occur, and every proposed principle faces counterexamples, faces cases where intuition says composition occurs, but the principle says it does not, or vice versa, and no principle has won consensus, and the problem of the one persists as a challenge to find the correct theory of composition. A third response questions whether the problem has a solution, argues that composition is vague, is indeterminate, that there are cases where there is no fact of the matter whether composition occurs, where the boundary between unified whole and mere collection is fuzzy. And this response treats the problem of the one as showing that reality is indeterminate in certain respects, that not all questions about existence have determinate answers, and some philosophers embrace this, accept vague existence, while others reject it as incoherent, as violating the law of excluded middle, and the debate continues. The problem of the one also affects our understanding of ourselves, of persons. because persons seem to be unified wholes, seem to be single subjects of experience, despite being composed of many cells, many organs, many subsystems. And what unifies a person? What makes a collection of cells? One person rather than many cells. And the answer cannot be just physical contiguity, because persons survive cell replacement, survive gradual change in material composition, and the answer seems to require psychological continuity, sameness of consciousness, unity of perspective. But these are not physical properties, are not features of cells, and so persons might not be physical objects, might be non-physical entities that somehow relate to bodies, and this threatens materialism, threatens the view that persons are nothing over and above their physical parts. And the problem of the one for persons remains unsolved, remains a challenge for theories of personal identity. The statue stands, one or many, unified or merely assembled, and the person exists, one subject or many cells, and the problem of the one persists, asking how unity arises, how the many become one, how parts compose wholes, and no answer fully satisfies. No theory explains unity without mystery, without positing irreducible relations or denying obvious unities, and the problem endures as a central puzzle in metaphysics, a challenge to explain what we take for granted, that objects are singular, are unified, are more than mere heaps of parts, and perhaps unity is primitive, is inexplicable, is something we must accept without analysis, or perhaps unity is illusory, is imposed by mind on parts that remain forever separate, and the problem remains, ancient and unresolved, a permanent fixture in ontology. The problem of other minds, how you know anyone else, is conscious. You observe a person crying, tears streaming down their face, and you infer that they are sad, that they are experiencing the subjective feeling of sadness, the inner emotional state. And this inference seems natural, seems obvious, but philosopher Bertrand Russell asks what justifies it. What evidence proves that other people have minds, have consciousness, have inner experiences like yours? And the evidence is purely behavioural. You see the tears, hear the words, observe the actions, but you never directly experience another person's consciousness, never feel their pain or see their thoughts. And so the inference from behaviour to consciousness is not logically certain, cannot be proven beyond doubt. And it is logically possible, conceivably, though perhaps not believably, that other people are unconscious automata, zombies who behave as if conscious but have no inner life. And this possibility, however remote, reveals that our knowledge of other minds is inferential, is based on analogy to our own case. And this is the problem of other minds. The epistemological challenge of justifying our belief that other people are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, that they are not merely sophisticated mechanisms producing behaviour without accompanying phenomenology. Imagine trying to prove that someone else has consciousness, trying to establish with certainty that they have subjective experiences, and you observe their behaviour, see them wince in pain, hear them describe their feelings, watch them respond appropriately to stimuli, and all this behaviour is consistent with consciousness, is what we expect conscious beings to do, but it is also consistent with unconsciousness, with sophisticated programming that produces appropriate responses without any inner experience, and there is no test, no observation, no experiment that directly reveals consciousness, that proves beyond doubt that someone else has subjective experiences, and so the inference to other minds is always uncertain, is always vulnerable to skeptical doubt. And while we do not actually doubt that other people are conscious, while the skeptical scenario seems absurd, the philosophical point is that our belief cannot be proven, cannot be established with the certainty we might desire. The problem of other minds rests on the asymmetry between first-person and third-person access to mental states. You have direct access to your own consciousness, immediate awareness of your own thoughts and feelings, but you have only indirect access to others' consciousness, can only infer it from their behaviour and their reports. And this asymmetry creates an epistemological a gap between what you can know with certainty about yourself and what you can know about others, and crossing this gap requires inference, requires reasoning from observed behavior to unobserved mental states, and such inference is never certain, always vulnerable to error. The traditional solution to the problem of other minds is the argument from analogy, which says that I observe a correlation in my own case between mental states and behavior. I know that when I am in pain, I exhibit certain behaviors. When I am sad, I cry, and so on. And I observe that other humans exhibit the same behaviors. And by analogy, I infer that they have the same mental states, that when they exhibit pain behavior, they are in pain. And this analogy is strengthened by the similarity between my body and their bodies, by the fact that we share similar physiology, and so it is reasonable to infer that we share similar mental lives. But critics of the argument from analogy point out that it is based on a sample size of one. On my own case, and generalizing from one case to all cases is weak induction. And moreover, the analogy assumes what it sets out to prove, assumes that behavioral similarity indicates mental similarity, and this assumption is precisely what the skeptic challenges. Visualize the epistemic situation. You are confined to your own consciousness, your own first-person perspective, and everyone else exists outside this perspective, exists as objects in your experience rather than as subjects with their own experiences. And the question is how you know that these objects are also subjects, also have inner lives, and the answer cannot be certain, cannot be proven, can only be inferred with greater or lesser confidence. And this realization that our knowledge of other minds is uncertain is one of the permanent features of the human epistemic situation, a gap that cannot be fully closed. Another approach to the problem of other minds appeals to the best explanation, argues that the hypothesis that other people are conscious, that they have minds, is the best explanation of their behavior, that positing consciousness explains why people speak as they do, why they report experiences, why they act purposefully, and so on. And while the zombie hypothesis, the hypothesis that people lack consciousness, is logically possible, it is not plausible, not the best explanation, and so we are justified in believing that other people are conscious, even though we cannot prove it with certainty. And this response treats knowledge of other minds as a theoretical inference, as a hypothesis confirmed by evidence, rather than a conclusion proven with certainty. A third approach, associated with Wittgenstein, questions the framework of the problem, argues that the idea of privately checking whether another person is conscious is confused, that consciousness is not a hidden inner property that might be present or absent while behavior remains the same, but is manifested in behavior, is constituted by appropriate responsiveness, and there is no gap between behavior and mind, no possibility of zombie-like creatures that behave as if conscious but lack consciousness, because consciousness just is the pattern of appropriate behavior, and the problem of other minds dissolves, because it is based on a misunderstanding of what consciousness is, treats it as an inner object rather than as a pattern of life. The problem of other minds connects to debates about artificial intelligence, about whether machines could be conscious because the same epistemic situation applies. We observe the behavior of AI systems, see them generate text, respond to questions, exhibit apparently intelligent behavior, and the question arises whether there is consciousness behind the behavior, whether the machine has subjective experiences, or whether it is merely processing symbols without understanding, and our inability to solve the problem of other minds for humans makes the question of machine consciousness even more difficult, even more uncertain, and we face the possibility that we may never know whether AI is conscious, may never be able to prove or disprove machine sentience. The problem also has practical implications for how we treat non-human animals, for whether they have consciousness, feel pain, deserve moral consideration, and our evidence is behavioral. We see animals exhibit pain behavior, avoid harm, seek pleasure, and we infer that they are conscious, that they have subjective experiences, but the inference is uncertain. Is more uncertain the more different the animal is from us? And the problem of other minds makes it difficult to establish definitively which animals are conscious, which can suffer, which deserve protection. You see the person crying, and you believe they are sad, and you comfort them, and the interaction proceeds as if their consciousness is real, as if their suffering matters. And practically, this is enough. Socially, this is how we function. But philosophically, the question remains, how do you know? How can you prove that they are not a sophisticated zombie? That there is really someone home behind the tears? And the answer is that you cannot prove it, can only infer it, can only trust in analogy and explanation, and the shared form of life that suggests consciousness is universal among humans. And the problem of other minds persists, not as a practical obstacle, but as a philosophical recognition of the limits of knowledge, the gap between self and other, between first-person certainty and third-person inference. And the problem endures as a permanent feature of epistemology, a reminder that some things cannot be known with certainty, that consciousness is private, that the inner life of another remains always partially hidden, always known only through the indirect evidence of behaviour and report. And the crying continues, and the inference to sadness continues, and life proceeds, and the problem remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a gap that defines the epistemic situation of embodied minds, trying to know other embodied minds, and the question persists, how do you know anyone else is conscious? And the honest answer is, you do not know with certainty. You only believe with confidence but without proof. And this uncertainty is part of what it means to be human, to be a conscious being among what you believe are other conscious beings, but can never know for certain. The repugnant conclusion, why creating billions of barely happy people seems better. A utilitarian philosopher sits with a calculator, attempting to determine which world is best, which future humanity should aim for, and the principle guiding the calculation is simple. Maximize total happiness, create the most good, ensure that the sum of well-being across all people is as large as possible. And this seems like a reasonable goal, seems like an obviously good principle. Who could argue against making the world contain more happiness rather than less? And yet when this principle is applied consistently, when the logic is followed to its conclusion, the result is deeply counterintuitive, deeply troubling. And this troubling result is called the repugnant conclusion, first articulated by philosopher Derek Parfit. And it says that for any world containing a population of people living excellent lives, lives of great happiness and fulfillment, there exists a better world, according to utilitarian calculation, containing a much larger population, living lives barely worth living, lives that contain only slightly more happiness than suffering. And the second world is better, because even though each person is much less happy, the total amount of happiness is greater due to the vastly larger population. And this conclusion seems repugnant, seems to violate our intuitions about what makes a world good, and yet it follows logically from the principle of maximizing total happiness. Imagine World A, containing 1 billion people, and each person lives a wonderful life, a life filled with love, and beauty, and meaning, and joy, a life worth living many times over. And the total happiness in this world is enormous. And now imagine World Z, containing 1 trillion people, and each person's life is barely worth living, contains just slightly more pleasure than pain, just enough satisfaction to make existence preferable to non-existence, but not much more. No deep relationships, no profound experiences, just a thin layer of positive feeling spread across a vast multitude. And when we calculate total happiness, World Z wins, because even though each person is much less happy, there are so many more people that the total sum is greater. 1 trillion barely positive lives sum to more total happiness than 1 billion excellent lives. and according to the utilitarian principle that says we should maximize total happiness. World Z is better than World A. We should prefer it, should work to bring it about. And this seems absurd, seems like a reduction to absurdity of the maximizing principle, and yet the logic is impeccable, follows directly from the idea that goodness is total happiness. Visualize the choice as a graph. On one axis is population size, on the other axis is average happiness per person, and World A has high average happiness and moderate population, and World Z has very low average happiness but enormous population, and the area under the curve represents total happiness, and World Z has more area, more total happiness, despite having much lower average happiness. And the repugnant conclusion says we should prefer the world with more area, more total happiness, even though this means accepting a vast population of people whose lives are barely worth living. And this seems to violate basic intuitions about human dignity, about quality of life, about what it means to create a good world. Because most people would rather live in World A, would rather be one of the 1 billion living excellent lives than one of the 1 trillion living barely positive lives. And a theory that says World Z is better seems to have gone wrong somewhere. Parfit called the conclusion repugnant because it seems to endorse a world that intuitively seems worse, seems to recommend creating vast populations, living lives of minimal quality, and this conflicts with our sense that what matters is not just total happiness, but how that happiness is distributed, how good each person's life is, whether lives are worth living in a robust sense, rather than barely scraping by. And the paradox forces a choice, either accept the repugnant conclusion and bite the bullet, admitting that yes, World Z really is better, and our intuitions are wrong, or reject total utilitarianism, reject the principle that all that matters is total happiness, and adopt some alternative that avoids the conclusion. But every alternative has costs, has its own counterintuitive implications. One response is to adopt average utilitarianism, which says what matters is not total happiness, but average happiness per person. And by this measure, World A is clearly better than World Z, because the average person in World A is much happier, and the repugnant conclusion is avoided. But average utilitarianism has its own problems. It implies that we can improve the world by killing unhappy people, because removing people whose happiness is below average raises the average. And this seems even more repugnant than the original conclusion. An average utilitarianism also implies that a world with one extremely happy person is better than a world with 1 billion moderately happy people, as long as the single person's happiness exceeds the average of the billion. And this seems wrong, seems to sacrifice too much for the sake of avoiding one counterintuitive conclusion. Another response is to adopt variable value principles, where the marginal value of adding a person depends on the quality of their life. Creating people with excellent lives adds more value per person than creating people with barely positive lives. And this can avoid the repugnant conclusion by making World A better than World Z despite having fewer people, because the excellent lives contribute more value per person. But this approach requires specifying how the marginal value changes, requires drawing lines about which lives add how much value. And these lines seem arbitrary, and the approach faces technical difficulties, can generate cycles where A is better than B is better than C, and C is better than A, creating intransitive preferences that undermine rational choice. A third response is to reject consequentialism entirely, to argue that what matters is not just outcomes, not just how much happiness exists, but also rights, dignity, fairness. And these values are not captured by summing happiness and creating a world of 1 trillion people. Living barely worthwhile lives might maximize total happiness, but violates something important about human dignity, about what it means to respect persons. And this deontological response avoids the repugnant conclusion by appealing to values beyond happiness. But it must explain what these values are, how they are weighed against happiness, and whether they really should override considerations of total welfare. The repugnant conclusion also raises practical questions about population ethics, about how many people should exist, about whether we have obligations to create future people, and if so, what quality of life they should have. And these questions are not academic. They affect policy decisions about climate change, resource allocation, family planning, and sustainability. Because if creating more people is good, as long as their lives are worth living, then we should maximize population growth up to the point where additional people would lower everyone's quality of life below the barely worth living threshold. And this seems to recommend creating enormous populations living in poverty, which seems wrong. And if instead we think population should be limited to ensure high quality of life for each person, then we are rejecting total utilitarianism in favor of some other principle. And we need to say what that principle is and why it is right. Parfit himself was troubled by the repugnant conclusion, spent decades trying to find a population ethic that avoided it while remaining plausible, and he proposed various principles, but none fully satisfied him. And he concluded that population ethics is one of the hardest problems in moral philosophy, a domain where all theories seem to have deeply counterintuitive implications, and perhaps there is no fully satisfactory answer, no principle that aligns with all our intuitions, and we must choose which intuitions to preserve and which to sacrifice. And this choosing is itself a moral judgment, requires deciding what values are most important, and different people will make different choices based on different weights. They give to total happiness versus average happiness versus rights versus dignity. The calculator sits on the desk. The numbers are clear. World Z has more total happiness than World A. The calculation is not in doubt. And yet something rebels, something in us rejects the conclusion, insists that World A is better, that a world of 1 billion excellent lives is preferable to a world of 1 trillion barely positive lives, even if the total sum of happiness is less. And this rebellion reveals that our values are more complex than simple maximization, that we care about distribution, about quality, about more than just the sum, and the repugnant conclusion stands as a challenge to utilitarianism, as a reductio ad absurdum that forces reconsideration of the maximizing principle. And Parfit's legacy includes this unsolved problem, this paradox that shows the difficulty of systematizing our moral intuitions, the challenge of finding principles that match our judgments, and the repugnant conclusion remains, repugnant and unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of consequentialist ethics. A reminder that maximizing happiness may not be as simple or as obviously right as it first appears.